So what could this meeting between Prime Minister Carney and President Xi mean for Canada's fraught relationship with China and for Carney's ambitions to diversify trade? Well, Vina Nadjibulla is the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and she's here now. Vina, always good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, David.
It's been a tough couple of years for, this is high-level engagement, right at the very top. I mean, how should we see this meeting? How should we interpret this?
The meeting between Carney and Xi.
Yeah.
Yes, because everybody's paying attention to the Trump-Xi meeting, which
yes.
I think we need to speak about as well, because it'll have implications. But I think for Prime Minister Carney, it's important because he wants to recalibrate the relationship with China, and he wants to open up high-level dialogue. He essentially wants to say that Canada wants to have a relationship that allows us to advance some of our interests, particularly around trade and commercial relations. But I think we should have modest expectations, because it's going to take a lot more than one meeting to be able to find an equilibrium and a type of relationship that can serve our interests and protect our values and our national security concerns.
Well, the Prime Minister kind of made that point, I think it was last week, where he drew a distinction between a meeting that would be transactional and a meeting that would be about relationship building, because
right.
Let's face it, for the last number of years, things have been very bad with China.
Absolutely.
And the EV tariffs are the latest irritant in this, and it's almost looking for a reset there with the reset here, right?
Yes, which will take time, because, again, we have to recognize that China's coming into this meeting, and President Xi's coming into this meeting very confident. I mean, he feels that he's winning the trade war. He feels that because of everything that the U.S. is doing, the sort of momentum is behind China. So I think we need to realize that not only is it difficult to negotiate with China on any day, but in this particular context, we really don't have a lot of cards. So yes, we want to improve the relationship, but we have to be cautious at the same time and have really modest expectations of what's possible in the short term.
Okay, so as you mentioned, we should talk about the Trump-Xi
yes.
meeting. So what are you watching for on that one? I mean, the two biggest economies, the two most powerful countries
Absolutely.
on earth sitting down.
So both of them want to de-escalate, and President Trump also wants to have some wins, because he basically wants to announce that he's achieved something on soybeans, particularly because American farmers are suffering. So he definitely wants to have some relief on soybeans. He wants to be able to say that there's progress on fentanyl. So we might be seeing some reduction of tariffs on China that were imposed on fentanyl. And then, of course, he's very much hoping that President Xi and China will not move forward with their export controls on rare earth. Because you might remember earlier this month, China sort of used this nuclear option of essentially saying that they're going to bring in export controls on rare earth. And they, of course, control 90% of that supply. So that could be really devastating to not just the U.S., but the global economy and everybody who relies on that from China. So I think what we're going to see is an agreement around this framework deal that the officials have negotiated in Malaysia, and some announcements around that. But I think we also have to recognize that even if they have the ceasefire, which I think is what we're going to see in the next few hours, an announcement of extension of the truce between the two big economies, we have to recognize that it's going to be fragile. It could change in any moment. And as we well know, and both countries are still trying to diversify and reduce reliance on each other. So the big trend in that relationship, David, is that they're moving further apart.
Okay, so the Canada-U.S. thing is its own dynamic, but the Canada-China problems in trade right now are a consequence of trying to align with the United States, right? So if there is a ceasefire between Trump and Xi, is there room there for Canada then to move on the EV tariffs without upsetting the president? Because canola farmers and people in the fishery are keen to have some relief here.
Absolutely. So whatever we do with China has to take into account our discussions with the U.S. And unfortunately, the reality is U.S. may wish to have a ceasefire itself with China, but it might still impose conditions on what we can do with China. And that we're already seeing in the agreements that Trump signed in Malaysia, with Malaysia as well as with Cambodia. He essentially put in language into those agreements that make sure that Malaysia and Cambodia align with the U.S. when U.S. has export controls or tariffs. So in a sense, I guess what I'm trying to say is the U.S. is trying to have as much flexibility as possible for itself, but it's also limiting some of its partners when they're dealing with China. That's why I think Prime Minister Carney said that the goal here is to be able to preserve access to the U.S. market and secure as good of a deal as we can get, and preserve agency to be able to make deals with others. Now, that's, again, easier said than done. So I think what we'll see is that there will be a series of meetings, both between Trump and President Xi, also between Prime Minister Carney and Xi. So this is just the beginning of a series of meetings. And we'll have to watch closely how the relationships evolve on both tracks and what are the implications.
So, all of this is part of the Prime Minister's goal to try to double non-U.S. trade exports
in 10 years.
In 10 years. So Europe is obviously a big part of that, but Asia is a massive part of that. China, South Korea, the Philippines, who they just,
Japan.
All of it, right? So, I mean, how do you see this trip advancing that goal and the importance of some kind of a reset with China in terms of getting there?
So absolutely. There's no way mathematically we can get to doubling non-U.S. trade without a lot more trade with Asia. But Asia is much more than China. So China is an important market, 3.8% of our exports. But we need to do a lot more with Southeast Asia, a lot more with India, Japan, South Korea, Australia. So it'll take, unfortunately, there's no way for us to replace U.S. with any one market. No. And there's really no way for us to only do trade with China because China comes with many risks, right? So we have to basically deepen relations at the same time as we de-risk relations. So on things like canola, 67% is too much, right? So we need to reduce that reliance on China while maybe we sell them more of our oil and gas, right? So there are sectors in which we can do more with China, but there are sectors in which we must reduce strategic dependence because China will hit us as they've done multiple times.
No, we're learning what it's like to be overly reliant on the two greatest markets with two very volatile and punitive governments. A quick 20 seconds left. I mean, what's a good outcome for Mark Carney coming out of this? Like, what sort of a headline will be good for Canada on this relationship?
On relationship with China?
With China, yeah.
That there is now a process for resetting the relationship and that Canada will be moving carefully while preserving its interests. Some kind of an indication on the canola, a goodwill gesture from China that they're willing to remove that while recognizing that it will take time on EVs because Canada can't move on EVs until we have clarity with the U.S.
Yeah, and that could take a while. Vina Nadjibulla with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Always appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.